So it seems like people really love Hondas, so the only real thing to do is to get another Honda on the channel. And not just any Honda, this is the Honda Civic FD2 Type R, which is the only saloon Honda Civic Type R that they've ever made. So I wanted to bring it onto the channel today to find out what it's really like, because I've driven the FN2 Type R, I've driven the EP3 Type R, so it's only right I bring in this unicorn and see what it's like. So on this episode of Cars with Jay, I'm going to drive the FD2 Honda Civic Type R.
The Civic Type R was introduced in August 1997, exactly 22 years ago. Its badge first appeared on the EK9, which was based on the 6th generation Civic. Then later it followed with the EP3, based on the 7th generation Civic. At this point, both of these cars left such a mark on the car scene with incredible performance and reliability that Honda really had to push the boat out in order to keep their consumers ecstatic. To which, with the launch of the FN2 Civic Type R, based on the 8th generation chassis, they also released in Japan a FD2 Type R. Now, according to the web, there are 13,000 FD2 Type Rs built between 2007 and 2010, before it had to cease production due to emissions. To be honest, I didn't think there was that many built, but if I'm wrong, please correct me. The FD2 was the first four-door Civic Type R with an increased wheelbase of 130mm compared to the EP3. It was only available in Japan, and fortunately for them, the K20A received an increase in power from 200 brake horsepower to 221, independent rear suspension, and a limited slip diff, things that did not feature on the FN2 in the UK market at the time.
So then, inside the FD2 Honda Civic Type R, the first saloon Honda Civic Type R and the only saloon Honda Civic Type R that they've made. So looking in front of me, the interior seems very familiar to the FN2 Type R. We've got a rev counter in front of me and we've got a digital speedometer ahead of that. I really do like that setup. Everything's centralized, everything's driver focused. You don't have to glance away from the screen to look at what you're doing or what speed you're doing, which is good. So looking down, you've got an analog rev counter. I really like this analog rev counter because you can really see it dance around under heavy load, and that's what these cars are about. They're all about hitting VTEC, and you want to see it get up to 8,000 RPM, and you want to see that needle move. In the FN2 Type R, they've got a sort of analog rev counter, but it's not really an analog rev counter. You can't see the full needle, but this is a little bit more older in design. It looks a bit more classier, but I really do like it. It's very driver focused. The interior overall, it does feel older than the FN2. I mean, this car did come out around about the same time the FN2 was launched, but it didn't follow every single design cue that the FN2 had. So it sits in a weird place because it's not as modern as the FN2, but it's not as old as, say, for example, the EP3. It's kind of in the middle, and you can see where they've kind of tried to improve it. But, you know, they've saved most of what they did for the FN2. So yeah, it's not as modern as the FN2, but it does have all the creature comforts, and this particular one has a nice Kenwood stereo as well, which obviously then you get sat nav and you get your iPhone connectivity and stuff like that. So it does have the creature comforts. The seats are really comfortable in this car. What I find is that they are the same as the FN2 and EP3. They're quite comfortable, they're quite well padded. You've got good shoulder support, which actually makes up for the lack of lumbar support. Although I'm quite a skinny guy, so maybe if you're a bit bigger, you'd probably sit more into these a bit better. I do love the gear knob on these cars because it's got like a nice ball shape to it, and I do find those very ergonomic and easy to use. So from a driver's perspective, it's quite nice, and just on initial changing the gears, it does feel very similar to the FN2 Type R and not the EP3. So I can see where they've kind of perhaps used the linkages or the system from that. So it does feel very similar. In terms of the handbrake, quite ergonomic design, very unique to look at, but ergonomic nonetheless, easy to grab, easy to use. So, I mean, that's it. That's pretty much the interior of this car. It's not a high-tech modern interior, but it definitely has that classic feel to it without it being way too old. So I think that settles everything for the interior. Let's take it for a drive and let's see how it goes.
Right, before we get into how this car drives, I'm going to quickly show you what the 0 to 60 is like in this car. Now, it's been reported it does it around 6 to 6.3 seconds, which I can kind of believe based on what I've experienced. But let's see how it does in 3, 2, 1.
Most interested about this car is what it's like to drive, because it's the only saloon Honda Civic Type R that they've made, and they seem to have released it at a really unique time period, because the EP3 was, they finished selling that. They had the FN2, which has just come into the market, but buyers also had the option for this, which you could argue is pretty much like the same kind of package as an FN2, but just giving you the option of 4 doors. But the car is more different than that. It actually has a few other features that the FN2 doesn't have. So what we really liked from the EP3 was that it had independent rear suspension. Now this car also has independent rear suspension. It hasn't moved over to the torsion beam suspension like the FN2 has, which is actually a really good move by Honda. Okay, let's see what this car's about. So off the bat, we've got AD08 tyres, which really do aid in this car's handling, and just the dramatic kick of VTEC really does make this drive a bit exciting on the right country lane. But the brakes as well in this car, they're just so sharp. The chassis is extremely playful because of that independent rear suspension, which we found. It feels very similar to the EP3, but because it's longer wheelbase, what you have is a bit more stability control when it goes into corners. Now the road surface that I'm driving on right now isn't always the best because it's quite bumpy. It means that the car's quite skittish. I see the owner in the passenger seat next to me. He's kind of flying about the interior because he doesn't have necessarily a steering wheel to hold on to. But this thing is a real heap of fun. That is really just something else in this car. I do think the long wheelbase really does aid in this car. Really, really does.
Braking on this car is incredible. The pedal is super responsive with enough play to allow nice, easy control. Still prefer it to be a bit more under servo than it is, but it's not difficult to get used to. It does help that the car only weighs 1270 kgs, which is not heavy at all. I will leave a link in the description to a fantastic website to find out more information about the features of the FD2. Now, you might be thinking, Jay, why not just get an Integra Type R? Of course, there are a few reasons that come down to preference, but ultimately the FD2 is a much better car as the chassis is far more advanced, being 50% more rigid than the DC5. However, I haven't driven the DC5 yet, so hopefully soon I'll get to review one and I'll give my opinion on that. Maybe it will change my mind, but down to specs and stats, the FD2 takes the cake. Looking on the used car market, an FD2 can be purchased for around £13,000, which is considerably more expensive than an EP3. However, in my opinion, it's absolutely superb to drive and much better than both the FN2 and EP3. In reality, I think spending half the money on a well-sorted EP3 is the way forward for the majority, as it doesn't tie too much cash into something you want to enjoy.
I just love front-wheel drive cars so much because you get so much trust on the front wheels. You know that the back end can kick out, but you know how you can account for that. Yeah, you can just follow through, just apply on the throttle, the rear end straightens up, and you know what to do. Rear-wheel drive cars, four-wheel drive cars, you can enter all sorts of like oversteer, understeer, especially with four-wheel drive cars, you know. But front-wheel drive cars just seem a whole heap of fun because you can have a bit of fun with it. You can go sideways with it. To be honest, if you are handy with the left foot braking, I found that this thing can turn in quite aggressively. But it's all set up really, and it's all knowing the car. I do recommend if you get a car, any car, take it to a track, really find out what its limits are, because you don't really want to find that on the public road because you're probably going to have an accident and there's probably going to be no runoff and there goes your car. So yes, find an adequate place to test your car, but make sure it's on the track and in a safe place. But this car really has a lot to give, and I can feel so much characteristics from the EP3 in this particular car, which may mean that you could get an EP3 instead of one of these if you want to save a bit of money and have a bit of fun. But what you're missing out on is that longer wheelbase. Now, I don't know exactly off the top of my head now how much longer it is, but the longer wheelbase aids in its stability around corners, but it does mean that you have more chance of understeering. So being a bit nifty with a left foot brake will be very beneficial to you when you're driving this car. And also I need to get used to the fact that the windscreen wipers are on the left hand side and the indicators are on the right hand side. So only JDM cars have that on the right hand side, so just something to get used to, but I guess if I drove this car a bit more, I'd probably get used to it in no time. So then, that's the FD2 Type R, and what an insane car it is. I remember when I first found out what these cars were, I've always wanted to drive one, and I'm glad I got the chance to do so. So thank you very much to Jit, my friend, for helping me get behind the wheel of this car. This is actually his car, very low mileage and clean example. So how good is this car then? What is it actually like to drive, and what did I think of it in the end of it? Well, I've driven an EP3 and an FD2 Type R. If you've seen my reviews on those, you'll know what I thought about them. But in summary, EP3 is a very playful car and it's really fun to drive. The FD2 is to some extent equally as fun, but it's a heavier car, it's a bit more modern, and that's what lets it down. Now this car came out when the FD2 was launched, but what's good is that Honda used the parts bin in a good way. They took what made the EP3 so great and incorporated it into the FD2. So for example, the independent rear suspension, it really makes this car playful. But then on top of that, it's still relatively lightweight. It feels lightweight when you drive it. It doesn't feel heavy at all, considering the fact that it is a 4-seater and a 4-door. So moving on then, the FD2, what did it take from that made it so great? It's got limited slip diff. Now, if you know, FD2s came with limited slip diff as standard after 2010 when they got a facelift version. But this got a limited slip diff, and it also got the K20 engine, which all of the Type Rs have. But this got a little bit more than that. Instead of getting around 200 brake horsepower, it got 225. And with its limited slip diff, it really does put the power down well. Even entering corners, it just manages to lay down the power really, really well. And on AD08 tyres, this thing works in perfect harmony with the rest of the car. It is honestly an amazing driving experience, and it's hard to realise, but 4 doors and a longer wheelbase can be a hell of a lot of fun, just as much as a short wheelbase hot hatch. So I hope you enjoyed this episode of Cars with Jay. If you like this episode, please give it a like rating, and if you want to see more content from me, please subscribe.